We are about to enter now the Vayeshev portion, and this year, during this week, we would also celebrate a very important date in time or place in time. We would celebrate the 19th of Kislev. The 19th of Kislev in the Hebrew calendar marks the birth of Chassidut, of Hasidism. This date is celebrated all around the world as the new year, the Rosh Hashanah of Hasidism. It was on this date, on the year of 1798, that the founder of Chabad Hasidism, Rabbi Shneur Zalman of Ladi, was freed from imprisonment in the Russian jail. But more than a personal liberation, this was a watershed event in the history of Hasidism, heralding a new era in the revelation of the inner soul of Torah. Rabbi Shneur Zalman of Ladi saw his imprisonment as well as his liberation and redemption as events that were reflecting what was transpiring above. He regarded his arrest as but an earthly echo of a heavenly indictment against his revelation of the most intimate secrets of the Torah and his teachings. And he saw his release as signifying his vindication in the heavenly court. Following his liberation on 19th of Kislev, he redoubled his efforts, disseminating teachings on a far broader scale and with more detailed and down-to-earth explanations than before. 19 in Kislev was also the date on the 1772, on the year of 1772, that remarks the Hilulah, the passing date of the Maggid of Mezrich, the successor of the Baal Shem Tov, the founder of Hasidut. At the same date, 19 of Kislev, in the year of 2003, Saddam Hussein was captured. And on the same date, on 2011, Iraq war has come to an end. Miraculously enough, on that same date, 19 of Kislev, on 2017, only 2 years ago, the US President Donald Trump publicly and formally announced that Jerusalem is the capital of the nation-state of Israel and declared that the US Embassy will or shall be relocated there. So as we can see, this is a remarkable date we should really take under consideration, whether it's an occasion of liberty or victory. Again and again, when 19 in Kislev is coming, something great happens, something that through it we can actually witness the divine providence in our lives. So in this portion, Vayeshev portion, as we shall see, is talking exactly about this. It's talking exactly about divine providence, asking us to remember that Hashem is with us always, all the time, asking us to cherish our relationship with the divine, with God, and to remember that He is taking care of us and watching us from in everywhere we are. Learning the Torah, as the Rabbi Milubavitch said, should result in practice. And so let us now go to the actual story, to our portion, and discover the hidden layers on this week's story. So in Vayeshev portions, from the forefathers' consciousness, from the individual patriarchs, we can say Avraham, Yitzchak, Yaakov, we are now spreading onto 12 dimensions of self. Bear with me. Those are signified by the 12 children of Jacob. This process of conscious separation and the appearances of multidimensional self will naturally not come without any consequences. So in our portion, the story shifts from Yaakov to his children. Here in this portion, as the story of the Jewish family, the most famous Jewish family, progresses, the tension we have already sensed between the mothers, Rachel and Leah, is transferred to the next generation, to the children, in the form of rivalry between Yosef and his brother. This story that is about to twist and turn will eventually take us to the end of the book of Roots, the book of Bereshit, Sefer Bereshit, our story's main figure now is shifting from Yaakov to Yosef. Yosef is the 11th of the 12 brothers, or as the firstborn of the beloved wife Rachel. He is also Yaakov's favorite son. Now, the envy and antagonism that Yosef's brothers felt toward him led them to sell him into slavery in Egypt, an act that will eventually, many years later, result in the entire family, by then a nation, being enslaved in that place. But this is the promise that Abraham received, so it doesn't come to us by a surprise, isn't it? We can say that Yosef grew up as somewhat of a spoiled child, as the beloved son who received gifts and special attention from his father. He saw himself as the true heir, as the beloved boy. So he was also, in a way, inviting this too much attention towards himself. Also, he was, according to the story, somewhat of a wonder child who has been giving the divine gift, we can say, of dreams, and not just ordinary dreams, but dreams of prophecy. So, yet nothing in this kid's life, in Yosef's life, has gone the way he presumably wanted or expected. Growing up as an orphan, he was hated by his siblings, who throw him into an empty pit in the middle of nowhere. Abandoned and lost, he was sold into slavery, had to change his identity and unwillingly leave his homeland, the land of Israel. Later framed by an Egyptian princess, we can say, who accused him in raping her, he was condemned to the dungeon where he was falsely imprisoned for a long time. Interestingly, Yosef, that same spoiled child who wasn't so fortunate during his childhood and adolescence, at the age of 30, rises to become the viceroy of Egypt and the savior of the entire Jewish nation, the Israeli family, as well as the mind behind the brilliant plan that actually saved the entire nation of Egypt and maybe the entire world from famine. Is there any connection between the two parts in Yosef's life? And where was God in this story? Because if through Yosef the redemption of Israel is about to take place, then how come this child was falsely accused all the time and abandoned by all? Why did God allow all those things to happen to Yosef? Yosef's story is probably the best example for us as believers to examine our faith in divine providence. God is watching over us, and he is doing so by allowing life to take its natural course. Because of his concern for our ultimate growth and success, he refrains from preventing us from falling. We have been, let's say, placed in a reality that allow us to err, to make mistakes, to know grief and heartache, to endure pain, because all those things are circumstances on which we allow us the opportunity of growing. It is through the struggle, the turmoil, that we become fully appreciative of life. Yosef was blessed even in his downfalls. Both of his imprisonments serve as steps in his personal journey, as usually happened to us as well. The first brought him out of his father's home and down to Egypt, where he began his rise to power. The second established him as an indispensable, invaluable resource to Pharaoh, the highest power of the world back in the days. In that sense, paradoxically, the prison, a place which is restricting our personal movement, can put us on the path towards playing a humongous role in national redemption. Now let us take Yosef's story and ponder about it a bit. Let's make this portion this week our own, or let's understand where we can find ourselves in the story. So sometimes we can find ourselves trapped and imprisoned, just like Yosef and just like Shneur Zalman of Vladi, in a situation we did not ask for. We can be imprisoned in our thoughts, in our feelings, in our emotions, or in our choices, We can be imprisoned by circumstances, imprisoned by others, or imprisoned by ourselves. Sometimes life seems too narrow and unsatisfying for us. We can be ill or lack of any motivation to do anything, and therefore feel imprisoned at home or at our working place. Sometimes we feel trapped by relationships that do not benefit us or do good with us, and or simply live under the impression that the place we are in life captures us without we have the ability to grow and evolve. The Parashat Vayeshev asks us to examine this feeling exactly. It takes us exactly there. Yosef signifies this place within ourselves on two occasions. The first, when he was finding himself deep down in a dark and gloomy pit full with snakes and scorpions by Rashi. His brother put him there against his will. They imprisoned him, deprived him of his ability to rise up and shout and call for help. He wasn't able to communicate with his father. They prevented him to even say anything. He was just completely lost and abandoned there with his own brother. The second time Yosef found himself in a dungeon in the Egyptian prison after Potiphar's wife accused him for wrongdoings. There again, he found himself detached from the outside world and unable to communicate or even to free himself from a situation forced upon him by others. There too, just like in the pit before, he was cut off from the outside world and put into a dark and isolated place against his will. We read this story and we immediately feel sympathetic towards Yosef. But here we have to remember, or to be reminded, that even when things happen to us which are against our will, just like things happen to Yosef, there is a higher will of our own will. In fact, we need to remember that we live our life in a somewhat very narrow frame of consciousness, and that we do not really have the ability to understand, to observe, to grasp, or to comprehend the divine, the will of the Creator, the will of God, which is most of the times very different than our own will. Eventually, Yosef's experience of being alone and isolated in a dark place against his will led him to become one of the most influential people of the world, and he became the right hand of Pharaoh, who was the most powerful ruling king of that era, or those days, reigned over the greatest and most influential and powerful kingdom of Egypt. Notably, the Torah tells us that even when Yosef was in the darkest of circumstances and places, God was with him. Yosef's relationship with divinity remains strong and clear no matter the circumstances. When alone in the dungeon or in the pit, he was in a way forced to communicate with whomever was there, and the only thing that was there was the divine presence. And so he started to communicate with the divine presence, or the divine presence was his best and only friend. And so he would rely on that connection that he created with the divine presence to interpret dreams to other prisoners, a move that will lead him to interpret the dream eventually of the king Pharaoh. The Or Chaim Ibn Attar, who lived in Morocco in the 18th century, teaches us that the inspiration of Shekhinah, the divine presence, flows through a person proportionally to that person's openness to its presence within ourselves. For the Or Chaim, God was with him means that Yosef opened himself to divine flow, constantly looking for the divine presence in his life, in all that happened to him all the time. This biblical figure of Yosef was so submerged in communication and connection with the divine and with the love of God that whatever happened, he could not see or feel bad circumstances whatsoever. Yosef's journey enabled him to reach exactly the right place, to be able to save his family and the entire Israeli nation, and even Egypt, and maybe the entire world from famine. God remembers and accompanies him always. Yosef's figure is coming to teach us an important lesson, therefore. Yosef feels God with him even while being unfairly punished, accused, whether it is when his brothers abandoned him, whether it was when he was being enslaved in the Egyptian prison, being accused for things he didn't do and sent to the dungeon. Because his sense of God's presence is so strong, his sense of self isn't shaking. And this is a huge lesson for us to learn from Yosef. This quality in Yosef we must try to implement within ourselves. We must aspire his deep connection with God. What Yosef's story comes to teach us is the importance of cultivating the awareness that for him came so naturally, awareness that we are seen, cherished, and loved by the divine always. Even when circumstances seem bleak, even in the face of unethical behaviors towards us, we can and must seek and to find in every downfall opportunity for us to lift our eyes up, lift our hearts up, lift our hands up to God and his will, acknowledging his powers and the fact that his decision actually reign over us and not the other way around. When having this sense of oneness with God, we cannot fear. We are literally able to go through anything once we are adopting the right mindset. And isn't it interesting that in this portions in the first chapter of this week, Parashat Vayeshev, we cannot even find once the name of God. The entire chapter is talking about Yaakov's family, the siblings, the relationship between Yaakov and the children, the relationship between the children to themselves. And as we witness the story, as the story progresses, we do know that God is acting in the background, but at the same time, there is no explicit reference to him, to God. And by noticing this in continuance to what we already know, there are two lessons that are immediately derived from our Torah portion this week. The first is learning the value of communication with God, with the divine. Not to think never he's not there watching over us. Just like Yosef, we are to feel the presence of God always, even and precisely in times when we cannot really sense it. Second is the importance of being a deliberate reader of Torah. We have the ability, if we read sensitively enough and carefully enough, we can literally hear the voice of God speaking to us from the text. In numerous places in the Torah, if we are attentive enough, we can hear God not only speaking to our ancestors, but actually talking to us. For God's presence is not only in the heavens, it is on earth in our own existence. As we live from day to day, our life can seem like a meaningless sequence of random events, a series of accidents and happenstance that have no shape or inner logic. Life as we experience it can sometimes feel like a random call of somebody else's circumstances even. However, by looking at everything that happens to us back and again, in this beautiful life where everything is so mysterious and we do not know the essence of almost nothing, we obviously can understand that the opportunity we missed here led to an even better one there. That the shame we felt at our unintentionally offensive remarks towards someone or led to a more careful way that we will notice what we are saying in the future. Our failures, seen in retrospect many years later, usually turned out to have been our greatest successes and the deepest learning experiences. So we live life facing the future, but we understand life only when it has become our past. And this is exactly what we are, the idea or the mindset in this story of Vayeshev, in the story of Yosef, in this week's portion. At the beginning of next week's portion, we will discover that everything led to take Yosef and elevate him to become one of the greatest and important figures in the entire world. Pharaoh makes him his viceroy over Egypt, the greatest empire of the ancient world, at the age of only 30, and after a long and crazy life, Yosef has become the second most powerful man in the world. From the lowest pit, this child rises to dazzling heights. So remember this. If on some occasion this week you feel imprisoned or trapped by whatever this is, it can be people around you, it can be even your own self. Remember that if up until now we were dealing with the patriarchs, with the forefathers, with Abraham, Yitzchak, Yaakov and their wives, and structure with very defined in those big chunks, big pieces. So now everything spreads onto those 12 brothers that we will learn about during the next weeks and during the next portions. And this is an interesting thing, or start negotiating with those 12 parts within yourselves, because this will help you to, as the story progresses, to understand better how to create a nation within yourself. So have a Shabbat Shalom. Again, as always, I hope to see you next week.